3 weeks before my wedding, I discovered my father had given my entire wedding fund to my divorced sister because she needed it more than I did. What happened next destroyed my family, ended my engagement, and led me to discover something far more valuable than any wedding could have provided. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in September. I was sitting in my kitchen in downtown Phoenix, sipping coffee from the ceramic mug my fiancé Jake had brought me from his business trip to Portland, scrolling through final wedding vendor confirmations on my laptop. The autumn light filtered through the sheer curtains I had carefully selected to complement the sage green and ivory color palette we had chosen for our October ceremony. My name is Isabella Martinez, and 3 weeks before what should have been the happiest day of my life, I learned that trust is a luxury you cannot afford when family finances are involved. At 28, I had spent 18 months meticulously planning a wedding that would celebrate not just my marriage to Jake Morrison, but the culmination of everything I had worked towards since graduating from Arizona State with my business degree 6 years earlier. The wedding fund had been my father's idea, proposed when Jake and I announced our engagement during Christmas dinner 2 years prior. Roberto Martinez, owner of a successful chain of auto repair shops throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, had pulled me aside that evening with tears in his eyes and genuine pride in his voice. "Misha, your mother and I never had the wedding we dreamed of when we got married," he had said, his calloused hands holding mine with the gentleness that made him beloved by his grandchildren. "We were too young, too poor, too focused on just surviving. But you have built something beautiful with Jake, and I want to give you the celebration we never had. I am setting aside money every month so you can have the wedding of your dreams." The fund had grown steadily over those 2 years. My father contributed $1,500 monthly, my mother added $500 from her work as a school administrator, and I matched their combined contribution from my salary as a marketing coordinator at a renewable energy company. By September, we had accumulated nearly $60,000, enough to cover the venue, catering, photography, music, flowers, and all the details that would make our celebration perfect for our families and friends. Jake and I had chosen the Desert Botanical Garden for our ceremony, with its stunning backdrop of native cacti and mountain views that captured the essence of our Arizona home. The reception would be held at the adjacent pavilion, where we planned to serve a fusion menu that honored both my Mexican heritage and Jake's Midwestern roots. His family was traveling from Wisconsin, and mine would be gathering from across the Southwest, making this the largest family celebration in recent memory. The guest list included 120 people who had shaped our lives and relationships. My college roommates, Jake's fraternity brothers, our work colleagues, childhood friends, aunts and uncles and cousins who had watched us grow from awkward teenagers into responsible adults ready to build a life together. The photographer we had hired specialized in outdoor ceremonies and had shown us portfolios of couples celebrating in settings similar to ours, their joy captured in images that would preserve these memories for generations. Everything was progressing smoothly, until I received a phone call from our wedding planner Sarah Chen on that Tuesday morning that would divide my life into before and after. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately caught my attention, professional courtesy struggling with obvious concern. "Isabella, I am calling because there seems to be an issue with your final payment," she said carefully. "The check your father sent last week was returned by the bank due to insufficient funds. I wanted to reach out to you first before contacting him directly, in case there was some kind of banking error we need to resolve." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips as the words registered. Insufficient funds was impossible. My father was meticulous about financial management, a skill that had built his business from a single garage into a regional operation employing 47 people. He tracked every expense, maintained multiple accounts, and had never in my memory had any check returned for any reason. "Sarah, that has to be a mistake," I said, already reaching for my phone to call my father. "Let me contact him right now and figure out what happened. Can you try depositing the check again this afternoon?" Quote, "Of course," she replied, though her tone suggested she had encountered similar situations before. "Just keep in mind that we need the final payment cleared by Friday to confirm all vendor contracts." The caterer, photographer, and musicians all require payment confirmation before the weekend. After ending the call, I immediately dialed my father's office number. His secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had worked for him for 15 years, answered with her customary warmth. However, when I asked to speak with my father about the wedding payment, her response was unexpectedly evasive. "Isabella, your father is in meetings all morning, but I will have him call you back as soon as possible," she said in a tone that suggested she had been instructed to handle my call carefully. "Is this something urgent that cannot wait until this evening?" The evasiveness felt wrong. My father had never been too busy to discuss wedding plans, particularly financial matters that required immediate attention. Mrs. Rodriguez knew the wedding date was approaching and understood the importance of vendor payments. Her reluctance to connect me directly indicated something more serious than a simple banking error. I decided to drive to his main shop location during my lunch break, reasoning that face-to-face conversation would resolve whatever confusion had occurred more efficiently than phone tag. The Martinez Automotive headquarters occupied a full city block on the east side of Phoenix, with modern offices attached to 4 service bays that could accommodate everything from routine maintenance to major engine reconstruction. When I arrived, the parking lot was full of customer vehicles, and I could hear the familiar sounds of pneumatic tools and diagnostic equipment that had provided the soundtrack to my childhood. My father had often brought me to work during school holidays, teaching me to appreciate the honest labor that had provided our family with middle-class stability and the opportunity for me to attend college without accumulating student debt. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression when I walked into the office confirmed my suspicion that something significant was wrong. She avoided direct eye contact while informing me that my father was not available, despite the fact that his truck was parked in its usual spot and his office light was clearly visible through the glass partition that separated his workspace from the main reception area. "Isabella, perhaps you should try calling him at home this evening," she suggested with obvious discomfort. "He specifically asked me to have you contact him after 6 o'clock. The request to wait until evening felt ominous. In our family, important conversations happened immediately, not according to arbitrary schedules that served no apparent purpose. My father's avoidance suggested preparation for a conversation he knew would be difficult, which meant the banking error was likely more complicated than a simple administrative mistake. That afternoon dragged with the weight of unspoken anxiety. I attempted to focus on my regular work responsibilities, reviewing marketing campaigns for solar panel installations and wind energy projects, but my mind kept returning to possible explanations for the payment problem. Medical emergency requiring immediate cash. Unexpected business expense that temporarily depleted accounts. Identity theft or banking fraud that had compromised the wedding fund. Each possibility seemed unlikely given my father's careful financial management and multiple account structure designed specifically to prevent such problems. The wedding fund had been maintained in a separate savings account, isolated from business operations and routine household expenses. Access required both my father's and mother's signatures, a safeguard we had established to prevent accidental spending or confusion. Jake called during my drive home from work, his voice carrying the excitement of someone whose day had been productive and satisfying. He had secured a major contract for his construction company, a residential development project that would provide steady work through the winter months and potentially lead to additional opportunities with the same developer. "Bella, we should celebrate tonight," he said, using the nickname he had coined during our first year of dating. "This contract is exactly what we needed to feel confident about buying that house in Scottsdale after the honeymoon. I was thinking we could go to that new Italian place downtown and maybe stop by the bakery to finalize the wedding cake details." I wanted to share his enthusiasm, but the uncertainty about the payment problem made celebration feel premature. Rather than dampening his mood with concerns that might prove unnecessary, I suggested postponing our dinner plans until the following evening, citing fatigue and the need to catch up on wedding preparations. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone shifting from excitement to concern. "You sound stressed about something." "Just typical wedding planning anxiety," I replied, not entirely dishonest, but certainly not complete truth. "You know how these final weeks can be overwhelming with all the last-minute details. Tomorrow will be better once I get caught up on everything." At exactly 6 o'clock, I called my father's home number from my apartment, my hands trembling slightly as I dialed digits I had known by heart since childhood. My mother answered, her voice strained in a way that confirmed this conversation had been anticipated and dreaded. "Isabella, your father wants to speak with you," she said without preamble. "He is in his study. Please remember that he loves you very much, no matter what happens in this conversation." The warning was terrifying in its implications. My mother's tendency toward dramatic statements meant that serious situations were often understated rather than exaggerated. If she felt compelled to remind me of my father's love before we spoke, the conversation was going to be worse than anything I had imagined. "Mija." My father's voice carried the weight of exhaustion and regret when he took the phone. "I need to tell you something about the wedding money, and I need you to listen completely before you respond." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next words would determine whether I remained on solid ground or fell into an abyss that would change everything about my relationship with my family and my understanding of my place within it. "3 months ago, your sister Carmen called me in tears," he began, his voice heavy with the burden of choices that had seemed necessary at the time but now required justification. Her divorce was becoming uglier than we knew. Marcus was hiding assets, threatening to take the children, and her lawyer said she needed immediate funds to fight for custody and protect her future. Carmen, my older sister by 4 years, had been struggling through a contentious divorce for over a year. Her marriage to Marcus Delgado had deteriorated from romantic fairy tale to bitter warfare, with their 2 young children caught in the middle of disputes over money, property, and parenting responsibilities. I knew the situation was difficult, but I had not understood the extent of the financial devastation she was facing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She needed $60,000 to pay legal fees and secure temporary housing where she could keep the children. My father continued. The court was threatening to award custody to Marcus because he had maintained their house while she was staying with friends. Her lawyer said that without immediate action, she would lose her children permanently. The number hit me like physical force. $60,000 was the exact amount in our wedding fund, accumulated through 2 years of careful saving and sacrifice by our entire family. The coincidence could not be accidental, which meant my father had made a deliberate choice to prioritize Carmen's crisis over my celebration. "I gave her the wedding money, Isabella," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "All of it. She needed it more than you needed a party. You and Jake have good jobs, stable income, and you can have another wedding later when you can afford it yourselves." But Carmen was about to lose her children forever. I could not let that happen when I had the power to prevent it. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of my world collapsing. Not just the wedding plans, but my understanding of my place in my father's priorities, my trust in family financial commitments, and my confidence that the people who claimed to love me would honor their promises when fulfilling them became inconvenient. "Dad," I finally managed, my voice barely audible. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. We have vendor contracts, family flying in from out of state, deposits that cannot be refunded. How am I supposed to tell Jake that his family is traveling from Wisconsin for a wedding that cannot happen because you gave our money away without asking me?" "You can postpone it," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Explain the situation to Jake. His family will understand that sometimes family emergencies require difficult choices. You can have a small ceremony now and a big celebration later, when finances recover." The suggestion revealed how completely he misunderstood both the practical and emotional implications of his choice. Postponing a wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony meant losing deposits, disappointing family members who had made travel arrangements, and explaining to everyone who mattered to us that our celebration was less important than my sister's problems. More fundamentally, it meant accepting that my father viewed my happiness as disposable when compared to Carmen's needs, and that commitments made to me could be broken whenever something more urgent demanded attention. The precedent being established was that my priorities, my plans, and my financial security would always be secondary to family members who managed their lives less successfully. "Isabella, I need you to understand something," my father said when my silence stretched beyond his comfort level. Carmen is facing a situation that could destroy her children's lives forever. You are facing disappointment about a party. I made the choice that protects the most vulnerable people in our family. His characterization of our wedding as a party revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about what he had destroyed. This was not about entertainment or social status. This was about publicly celebrating our commitment before the people who had shaped our lives, creating memories that would anchor our marriage through future challenges, and honoring the partnership we had built through years of shared goals and mutual support. The wedding represented everything Jake and I had worked toward together. Our financial discipline in saving for something meaningful rather than spending impulsively on immediate gratification. Our ability to plan and execute a complex project that required coordination, compromise, and persistent effort. Our commitment to including both families in a celebration that honored our separate histories while creating our shared future. By reducing this to a party, my father was dismissing not just our celebration but our entire approach to building a life together. He was suggesting that careful planning, financial responsibility, and commitment to promises were less valuable than reactive crisis management and emotional decision-making. "Dad, I understand that Carmen needed help," I said, my voice gaining strength as the full implications of his choice became clear. "But you should have talked to me before taking money that belonged to all of us. This fund was not just your money to give away. Mom contributed, I contributed, and we all made sacrifices to build something together." "The money came from me," he replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was becoming more difficult than he had anticipated. "I provided the majority of the funds, and I made a judgment about how those funds could best serve our family. Carmen's children needed protection more than you needed a wedding reception." The reduction of complex family dynamics to simple financial accounting revealed how differently we understood family responsibility and mutual obligation. My father saw the money as his to allocate according to his judgment about family needs. I saw it as a collaborative investment in our shared celebration, with all contributors having a voice in how those resources were used. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but the fundamental positions remained unchanged. My father believed he had made a heroic choice to protect vulnerable family members from a crisis beyond their control. I believed he had broken a commitment to me in order to solve problems that Carmen and Marcus had created through their own poor choices and should have resolved through their own resources. When I finally ended the call, I sat in my apartment surrounded by wedding planning materials that had suddenly become evidence of naive optimism rather than careful preparation. Seating charts for guests who would now receive cancellation notices. Menu selections for a reception that would not happen. A dress hanging in my closet that would not be worn for its intended purpose. The immediate practical challenges were overwhelming. Vendor cancellations, guest notifications, refund negotiations, and explanations to Jake's family about why their travel plans were now pointless. But the deeper emotional damage was even more significant. My father had taught me that promises could be broken when keeping them became inconvenient, that my priorities were disposable when compared to my sister's crises, and that family loyalty flowed in only one direction. That night, I called Jake to explain what had happened. His response would determine not just how we handled this immediate crisis, but whether our relationship could survive the test of family conflict and financial betrayal that we had never anticipated facing together. The conversation that followed would teach me everything I needed to know about the difference between partnership and performance, between people who stand with you during adversity and people who abandon you when supporting you becomes complicated. 3 weeks before what should have been our wedding day, I discovered that sometimes the most devastating losses create opportunities for the most important discoveries about who you are and what you are truly capable of becoming. Jake's reaction to my phone call revealed everything I needed to know about the foundation of our relationship and his family's true feelings about marrying into mine. When I explained what my father had done with our wedding fund, the silence that followed was not the thoughtful pause of someone processing difficult information, but the cold calculation of someone reconsidering their investment in a situation that had suddenly become complicated. "Isabella, let me understand this correctly," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone he used during construction contract negotiations. "Your father took $60,000 that was designated for our wedding and gave it to your sister without consulting you. and now you are telling me that our wedding cannot happen as planned? The way he phrased the question suggested that he viewed this as my failure, rather than a family crisis that had blindsided both of us. I had expected shock, disappointment, perhaps even anger on my behalf about the betrayal I had experienced. Instead, I was hearing an assessment of whether this development made me a liability he could no longer afford to assume. "Jake, I am as shocked as you are," I replied, trying to maintain the collaborative tone that had characterized our relationship through 2 years of engagement planning. I had no idea my father was considering this, and I certainly did not approve it. "We need to figure out how to handle the situation together." "Handle the situation," he repeated, as if the phrase itself revealed something distasteful. "Isabella, my entire family has made travel arrangements from Wisconsin. My parents took vacation time from work. My grandmother, who is 83 years old, booked her first flight in 15 years to attend our wedding. And you are telling me that we need to cancel everything because your family has financial management problems?" The characterization of my father's choice as a financial management problem, rather than a moral decision about family priorities, revealed how differently we understood what had occurred. Jake was focused on the inconvenience and embarrassment of cancellation, while I was grappling with the betrayal of trust and the revelation that my father viewed my happiness as expendable when other family members faced difficulties. "This is not about financial management," I said, my voice gaining intensity as I realized how completely he misunderstood the significance of what had happened. "This is about my father breaking a commitment he made to us and prioritizing my sister's crisis over our celebration. I am the victim here, not the cause of the problem." "Right now, I do not care about who is the victim," Jake replied with a coldness that felt like a physical blow. "I care about the fact that I have to call my family tomorrow morning and explain why the wedding they have been looking forward to for months is not going to happen because your father decided to solve your sister's problems with our money." The phrase "our money" was technically accurate, since we had both contributed to the fund, but Jake's emphasis suggested ownership rather than partnership. He was not approaching this as a crisis we would navigate together, but as a problem I had created that he was now forced to manage. The distinction revealed something fundamental about how he viewed our relationship and his role within it. Over the next hour, our conversation evolved from shock and confusion to something approaching negotiation. Jake proposed that we proceed with a drastically scaled-back ceremony using his family's emergency savings, then pursue legal action against my father to recover the wedding fund after the fact. The suggestion demonstrated both his determination to avoid embarrassment with his family and his willingness to create permanent conflict within mine. "We can rent a small reception hall, hire a basic photographer, and have a simple dinner reception," quote, he explained, as if these compromises represented reasonable solutions rather than fundamental changes to everything we had planned together. "It will not be what we originally envisioned, but at least our families will not have traveled for nothing, and we can get married on schedule." The proposal revealed how differently we understood the meaning and purpose of our wedding celebration. For Jake, the ceremony was primarily about fulfilling obligations to family members who had made travel arrangements and maintaining the timeline we had established. For me, the wedding represented a public affirmation of our partnership and our shared values, something that could not be replaced with a hastily arranged substitute that satisfied logistical requirements while abandoning the meaning we had intended to create. "Jake, I appreciate that you want to solve this problem, but what you are describing is not our wedding," I said, trying to help him understand why his solution felt like another loss rather than a rescue. "We spent 18 months planning something that would represent who we are and what we value. A last-minute replacement ceremony would not accomplish what we intended. What we intended was to get married in front of our families," he replied with growing frustration. The specific venue and menu and photography details were nice additions, but they were not the essential elements. The essential element is making a commitment to each other, and we can do that regardless of whether we have the exact reception we originally planned. His reduction of our careful planning to nice additions revealed how little he understood about what the wedding had meant to me and what its cancellation now represented. The Desert Botanical Garden ceremony was not an arbitrary venue choice, but a reflection of our love for Arizona and our intention to build our life in the place where we had met and fallen in love. The fusion menu was not merely catering, but a celebration of our different backgrounds and our ability to create something new together. The photography was not just documentation, but an investment in preserving memories that would anchor our marriage through future challenges. By dismissing these elements as superficial details, Jake was essentially arguing that the thoughtfulness, planning, and meaning we had invested in our celebration were less important than the administrative task of getting married according to schedule. This perspective suggested a fundamental difference in how we understood partnership and shared decision-making. The conversation concluded with Jake agreeing to postpone any final decisions until we could meet in person the following evening. But his tone suggested that he viewed my reluctance to embrace his compromise solution as unreasonable stubbornness, rather than legitimate grief about the loss of something meaningful. When we ended the call, I felt more alone than I had before sharing the crisis with the person who was supposed to be my primary source of support. The next morning brought the first wave of systematic retaliation from my family for my refusal to accept my father's decision gracefully. My mother called at 7:30, waking me from the fitful sleep that had finally come near dawn, her voice carrying the strained patience of someone who had been designated to manage a situation she had not created. "Isabella, your father is very upset about your reaction to his conversation with you last night," she began without preamble. "He feels that you are being selfish and ungrateful, focusing on a party when your sister is fighting for her children's lives." The characterization of my response as selfish and ungrateful, rather than shocked and betrayed, revealed how my family had processed the situation overnight. Rather than acknowledging that my father had broken a commitment and created a crisis for me, they had reframed my emotional response as evidence of character flaws that needed correction. "Mom, I am not being selfish," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep and emotional exhaustion. "I am responding normally to discovering that Dad gave away money that belonged to all of us without consulting anyone. How is that unreasonable?" "The money belonged to your father," she said with the firmness that indicated this position had been established during family discussions that had not included me. "He earned it, he saved it, and he had the right to use it to help his daughter who was facing a genuine emergency. Your wedding is something you want, not something you need." The distinction between want and need was being used to justify breaking commitments and reordering family priorities without discussion or consent. By this logic, any promise could be broken, and any commitment could be abandoned whenever someone decided that alternative uses for resources were more urgent or more morally justified. "This is not about wanting versus needing," I said, struggling to remain calm while addressing what felt like a deliberate mischaracterization of the situation. "This is about keeping promises and honoring commitments that multiple people made together. Dad did not just give away his money. He gave away money that you contributed and that I contributed, for a purpose we all agreed on." "Isabella, your sister was about to lose custody of her children," my mother replied with growing impatience. "If you cannot understand why that is more important than your wedding reception, then you need to examine your priorities and think about what kind of person you want to be." The conversation was being framed as a moral test of my character, rather than a legitimate grievance about broken commitments and family betrayal. My mother was suggesting that objecting to my father's choice revealed selfishness and moral deficiency, while accepting it gracefully would demonstrate maturity and appropriate family loyalty. This reframing eliminated any possibility of productive discussion about the ethics of my father's decision or the appropriateness of his methods. Any criticism of his choice was automatically evidence of my moral failure, while any defense of my position was proof that I lacked proper perspective about family responsibilities. The call ended with my mother informing me that my father expected an apology for my disrespectful reaction, and my immediate cooperation in explaining to extended family members why the wedding had been canceled in a way that reflected positively on his decision to help Carmen. The expectation that I would apologize to him for being upset about his betrayal of me represented the complete inversion of accountability that would characterize my family's response throughout the crisis. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Carmen herself, who had apparently been briefed on the family position and was prepared to defend Dad's choice while expressing entirely theoretical sympathy for my disappointment. Her approach combined emotional manipulation with moral superiority in a way that made productive conversation impossible. "Isabella, I am so sorry that this situation has affected your wedding plans," she began with the careful tone of someone delivering a prepared statement. "I know you are disappointed, and I understand why this feels difficult for you. But I hope you can understand that I was facing the possibility of losing my children forever, and Dad made a choice to protect them." The phrasing suggested that my disappointment was a character flaw, rather than a reasonable response to betrayal, while her crisis was presented as a force of nature, rather than the consequence of choices she and Marcus had made throughout their marriage and divorce proceedings. The asymmetry in responsibility and accountability was striking and deliberate. "Carmen, I understand that you were facing difficulties," I replied, trying to maintain civility while addressing the fundamental issues that were being obscured by emotional appeals. "But Dad should have discussed this with me before taking money that I had also contributed to. This fund was not just his money to give away. Isabella, Dad saved my children," she said with the fervor of someone who had been rehearsing this justification. "When Marcus threatened to take them away from me, Dad stepped in and gave me the resources I needed to fight back. I cannot apologize for accepting help that protected my babies from a dangerous situation." The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with Carmen alternating between expressions of sympathy for my disappointment and moral lectures about the importance of family loyalty and sacrifice. She made no acknowledgement that accepting $60,000 from our wedding fund might have been inappropriate, and no suggestion that she felt any obligation to repay the money or help resolve the crisis her acceptance had created. Most significantly, she revealed that she had known about the source of the money when she accepted it. My father had not presented it as a general family emergency fund or business loan, but had specifically told her that he was giving her money that had been saved for my wedding. She had accepted it anyway, reasoning that her needs were more urgent and important than my plans. "I knew it would be disappointing for you," she acknowledged when I pressed her on this point. "But Isabella, I was about to lose my children. Any mother would understand that protecting your babies is more important than any wedding, no matter how much planning went into it." The expectation that I would understand and approve of her choice to accept money designated for my wedding revealed how completely my family had processed this situation as a moral hierarchy, rather than a conflict of legitimate interests. Carmen was not asking for my forgiveness or acknowledging any obligation to help resolve the crisis her acceptance had created. She was expecting my enthusiastic approval of her decision to prioritize her needs over my plans. When I suggested that she and my father could have explored alternative sources of funding for her legal expenses, Carmen became defensive and accusatory. She listed the various ways she had attempted to secure money independently, from borrowing against her retirement account to seeking loans from friends and extended family members. Her inability to secure adequate funding through these channels was presented as evidence that my father's choice was the only viable option, rather than an indication that her crisis might have been managed through less disruptive means. "Isabella, I tried everything else before asking Dad for help," she said with the exasperation of someone who felt her efforts were being unfairly criticized. "I would not have asked him to do this if there had been any other way to protect my children. But when you are facing the loss of your babies, you use whatever resources are available." The conversation concluded with Carmen suggesting that I should consider myself fortunate to have learned an important lesson about family priorities before my marriage, and that postponing the wedding might actually be beneficial for my relationship with Jake if it taught us both to focus on what truly mattered rather than superficial celebrations. This suggestion that the cancellation of our wedding was actually a gift rather than a loss represented the complete transformation of accountability that had occurred within my family over the course of 24 hours. Not only was I expected to accept the betrayal gracefully, but I was also supposed to be grateful for the life lessons it provided. That evening, Jake arrived at my apartment carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone who had reached conclusions that would not be subject to negotiation. His greeting was polite but distant, and he declined my offer of coffee with the briskness of someone conducting a business meeting rather than discussing our future together. "Isabella, I spent the day thinking about our situation and consulting with my family about the best way to proceed," he began, settling into my living room chair with the formal posture he used during difficult conversations. "I have reached some conclusions that I think we need to discuss." The folder contained financial projections for a scaled-back wedding ceremony, legal research about our options for recovering the money from my father, and what appeared to be a timeline for various courses of action we might pursue. The level of preparation suggested that Jake had approached our crisis as a logistical problem requiring systematic analysis, rather than an emotional trauma requiring mutual support. Based on my research, we have 3 realistic options, he continued, opening the folder and spreading documents across my coffee table like evidence in a legal proceeding. We can proceed with a simplified ceremony using alternative funding, we can postpone the wedding until we can accumulate new savings, or we can pursue immediate legal action to force your father to return the money he took from our fund. Each option was presented with financial calculations and timeline projections that demonstrated Jake's thorough analysis of our practical alternatives. However, none of the options addressed the emotional and relational dimensions of what had occurred, or acknowledged that my primary need might be support rather than solutions. Jake, I appreciate the work you put into this analysis, I said, studying the documents that reduced our relationship crisis to spreadsheet categories. But before we discuss logistics, I need to know that you understand what this situation has done to me and that you are committed to working through it together. Of course I understand that you are upset, he replied with the measured tone of someone who had anticipated this response. But right now, being upset does not solve our problem. We need to make decisions that will allow us to move forward, and emotion cannot be the primary factor in those decisions. His characterization of my emotional response as an obstacle to practical problem-solving, rather than a legitimate aspect of the crisis that required attention, revealed how differently we understood partnership and mutual support. Jake was approaching this as a logistical challenge that could be resolved through proper planning and execution, while I was experiencing it as a fundamental betrayal that had shaken my understanding of family loyalty and personal security. The conversation that followed would determine whether our relationship could survive the test of crisis, or whether Jake's commitment to me was conditional on my ability to maintain the comfortable circumstances that had made our partnership convenient and beneficial for both of us. As we discussed his 3 options, it became increasingly clear that Jake's primary concern was avoiding embarrassment with his family and maintaining the timeline we had established for our marriage, rather than supporting me through the trauma of betrayal and helping me navigate the complex family dynamics that would affect our future together. The choice I was being asked to make was not really about wedding logistics or financial planning. It was about whether I was willing to accept that the people who claimed to love me would abandon me when supporting me became inconvenient, and whether I was prepared to build a marriage on the foundation of conditional loyalty that such acceptance would represent. The meeting with Jake's family occurred 3 days after our crisis conversation, in the private dining room of the Marriott, where his parents were staying during what was supposed to be their wedding week visit. I had agreed to attend despite my reservations, because Jake had framed the gathering as an opportunity to explain our situation directly and potentially gain support from people who understood the importance of keeping commitments. What I encountered instead was a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to assess whether I remained a suitable candidate for marriage into the Morrison family, given the complications my family had introduced into their carefully planned celebration. Jake's mother, Patricia Morrison, had arranged the meeting with the precision of a corporate board review, complete with prepared talking points and predetermined outcomes. Isabella, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us during what must be a very stressful period, Patricia began, her tone carrying the professional courtesy she used in her role as a hospital administrator. Jake has explained the situation with your family and the wedding fund, and we wanted to discuss how this development affects our plans moving forward. The phrasing immediately established that this was not a support meeting, but an evaluation session. Patricia's reference to our plans rather than your plans indicated that the Morrison family viewed themselves as stakeholders in Jake and my relationship rather than supportive observers, with legitimate interests that needed protection from the chaos my family had introduced. Jake's father, Robert Morrison, sat quietly throughout most of the conversation, occasionally nodding approval when Patricia made points that aligned with his perspective. His silence was more ominous than active participation would have been, suggesting that he had already reached conclusions about my suitability that did not require additional discussion. We understand that family situations can become complicated, Patricia continued, consulting notes she had written on hotel stationery. However, we are concerned about the pattern of decision-making this incident reveals, and what it might mean for Jake's future stability if he marries into a family that handles financial obligations so irresponsibly. The characterization of my father's betrayal as irresponsible financial handling, rather than moral failing or broken trust, revealed how the Morrison family understood the situation. They were not interested in the ethics of taking money designated for one purpose and using it for another without consultation. They were focused on the practical implications of associating their son with people who could not be relied upon to honor their commitments. Mrs. Morrison, I want to assure you that I am as shocked and disappointed by my father's decision as you are, I replied, attempting to maintain diplomatic composure while defending my family's general character despite their specific failures. This behavior is not typical of how my family usually handles obligations, and I am working to resolve the situation appropriately. Isabella, we are sure you are disappointed, she responded with the measured tone of someone delivering prepared remarks. But our concern is not really about this specific incident. Our concern is about what this incident reveals about your family's approach to financial planning, crisis management, and keeping commitments. These are factors that will affect Jake throughout your marriage. The conversation was being framed as a risk assessment rather than a support discussion. Patricia was evaluating whether my family's demonstrated unreliability created unacceptable long-term exposure for Jake, given his professional reputation and financial stability. The wedding fund crisis was being treated as a diagnostic indicator of deeper problems that could not be resolved through individual remediation. Jake participated in this evaluation by providing additional context that portrayed me as a victim of family dysfunction rather than a partner deserving of support through a crisis. He explained my contributions to the wedding fund and my lack of involvement in my father's decision, but he presented these facts as mitigating circumstances rather than evidence of my character and integrity. Isabella has always been responsible about her personal finances, Jake told his parents, as if providing a performance review for their consideration. She contributed equally to our wedding savings, and she had no advance knowledge of her father's plan to redirect the money. The problem is not with Isabella individually, but with her family's crisis management and financial boundaries. While Jake's characterization was factually accurate, his clinical presentation of my situation felt like evidence being submitted to a tribunal rather than a partner defending our relationship to skeptical relatives. He was positioning himself as a neutral analyst of my family's problems rather than my advocate during a period of betrayal and loss. Patricia's response revealed the direction her thinking had taken during their family discussions about our situation. Jake, we appreciate that Isabella is not personally responsible for her father's decision. However, marriage creates permanent connections between families, and Isabella's family has demonstrated that they will involve her in their financial crises, regardless of her personal wishes or commitments. The assessment was both accurate and devastating. My family had indeed demonstrated that my resources and commitments could be redirected to serve their emergencies without my consent or consultation. Patricia was correctly identifying the precedent that had been established and the implications it would have for any future financial planning Jake and I might attempt. Furthermore, she continued, this incident suggests that Isabella's family does not understand or respect the concept of financial boundaries between family members. They view Isabella's money as available for their use when they determine the need is sufficient. This perspective will create ongoing conflicts throughout your marriage. The psychological and financial analysis was uncomfortably perceptive. My family had indeed demonstrated that they viewed my resources as part of a collective pool available for redistribution according to their assessment of relative need. My father's decision was not an isolated emergency response but evidence of a systematic approach to family finances that prioritized emotional appeals over legal obligations. Robert Morrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making final decisions in complex situations. Jake, your mother and I have discussed this situation extensively, and we have reached some conclusions that we think you need to consider seriously. The formal transition to conclusions indicated that the Morrison family had already determined their position and were now prepared to communicate their expectations to Jake. This was not a collaborative discussion about supporting us through a crisis, but the delivery of an assessment that had been completed independently. First, Robert continued, We believe that proceeding with marriage under these circumstances would be financially and emotionally unwise. Isabella's family has demonstrated that they will involve her in their problems, regardless of her personal commitments. And this pattern will continue throughout your marriage. The recommendation against marriage was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone Robert used for business decisions that were complicated but necessary. He was not expressing personal animosity toward me, but providing professional advice based on risk analysis and long-term financial planning considerations. Second, we think you should seriously consider whether Isabella's family dynamics are compatible with the stability and financial discipline you have worked to establish in your own life. Marriage should strengthen your foundation, not expose you to ongoing crises that are beyond your control. The suggestion that my family represented a permanent liability rather than a temporary crisis revealed how completely the Morrison family had reframed our situation. They were not viewing this as a single incident that could be resolved through proper boundaries and communication, but as evidence of fundamental incompatibility that would create lifelong problems. Jake's response to his family's assessment would determine whether he viewed their concerns as legitimate considerations requiring serious thought, or as inappropriate interference in our relationship that needed firm rejection. His reaction during the next 10 minutes of conversation revealed which perspective had gained his acceptance. "I understand your concerns," Jake said slowly, "and I have been thinking about many of the same issues. Isabella's family situation is more complicated than I realized when we got engaged, and this incident has forced me to consider what that means for our future together." The acknowledgement that he was quote, thinking about many of the same issues indicated that Jake had independently reached similar conclusions about my family's impact on our relationship. His parents were not introducing new concerns, but confirming analyses he had already been conducting privately. "The challenge," he continued, "is that Isabella cannot control her family's behavior, but she will always be connected to their problems. Even if we establish boundaries, there will be ongoing pressure for her to involve herself in their crises, and that pressure will affect our financial planning and decision-making." Jake's assessment demonstrated sophisticated understanding of family systems and long-term relationship dynamics. He correctly identified that my family's approach to mutual obligation would create ongoing conflicts with any attempt to maintain independent financial boundaries. His analysis was accurate, which made it more painful than criticism based on misunderstanding would have been. The conversation concluded with Patricia suggesting that Jake and I should postpone any immediate decisions about our relationship until we had more time to, quote, fully assess the implications of this development. The recommendation for a relationship pause was presented as wise caution rather than family pressure, though the practical effect was to create space for Jake to reconsider our engagement without appearing to abandon me during a crisis. "Isabella, we want you to know that we respect you personally and we understand that this situation is not of your making," Patricia said as we prepared to leave. "However, we also believe that Jake needs to consider carefully whether this is the right time and the right circumstances for marriage, given the complications your family has introduced." The diplomatic conclusion provided Jake with family support for questioning our engagement while maintaining plausible concern for my welfare. I was being released rather than rejected, with the understanding that our relationship was under review pending resolution of problems that might not be resolvable. That evening, Jake and I returned to my apartment for what would become the most important conversation of our relationship. The formal evaluation we had just experienced with his family had clarified the stakes and the expectations, but it had also revealed how completely our partnership had been reframed as a risk management decision, rather than a commitment to mutual support through adversity. "Isabella, I need to be honest with you about what I am thinking," Jake began, settling into the chair he had occupied during our previous difficult conversation. "This situation with your family has made me realize that I do not fully understand what I am committing to when I marry you." The admission represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed our relationship and our engagement. Rather than seeing marriage as a commitment to face whatever challenges arose together, he was reconceptualizing it as a contract that should be evaluated based on known risks and predictable outcomes. "When we got engaged, I thought I was marrying you as an individual," he continued. "But this incident has shown me that I am actually marrying into your family system, and your family system has problems that will affect our entire future together." The distinction between marrying me individually and marrying into my family revealed how Jake understood partnership and mutual obligation. He had expected to acquire a spouse without inheriting any associated complications or responsibilities, and the discovery that marriage connected him to my family's problems was being treated as a material change in the terms of our arrangement. Jake, every marriage involves joining two families with their own complications and dynamics, I replied, trying to remind him that perfect family situations did not exist and that partnership required accepting some degree of complexity. Your family has its own challenges and expectations that I have accepted because I love you and want to build a life with you. Isabella, my family has never taken money designated for one purpose and used it for something completely different without consulting the people affected. He responded with the precision of someone who had prepared for this discussion. My family has never created financial crises that required emergency interventions, that disrupted other people's major life events. The comparison was factually accurate and practically devastating. The Morrison family had indeed demonstrated more consistent financial boundaries and crisis management than my family had shown during this incident. Jake's assessment of the relative stability and predictability of our respective families was not unfair, even though it was being used to justify abandoning our relationship. Furthermore, he continued, this situation has shown me that you cannot protect our marriage from your family's problems. You had no advance warning about your father's decision, you had no ability to prevent it, and you have no apparent strategy for ensuring it does not happen again. Those are not criticisms of your character, but they are realistic assessments of what our future would involve. The analysis was both compassionate and final. Jake was acknowledging that I was not personally responsible for my family's dysfunction while simultaneously concluding that such dysfunction created unacceptable risks for our marriage. He was providing logical rather than emotional justification for ending our engagement, which made his decision more difficult to argue against. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, but the essential conclusion had been established within the first 30 minutes. Jake had decided that my family's demonstrated instability created long-term exposure that he was not willing to accept, and no amount of discussion about boundaries, communication, or commitment could change his assessment of the fundamental risk. When he left my apartment that night, we had agreed to a pause that would allow both of us to gain perspective on our situation without making hasty decisions during an emotional period. The diplomatic language obscured the reality that Jake was ending our engagement while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid appearing callous during my family crisis. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment surrounded by wedding planning materials that now represented the debris of a life that had been dismantled within a single week. The seating charts, vendor contracts, dress fittings, and honeymoon reservations that had represented our shared future had become evidence of naive optimism about the security of commitments and the reliability of the people who claimed to love me. The practical challenges were overwhelming. Vendor cancellations that would result in forfeited deposits. Guest notifications that would require explaining not just the cancellation of our wedding, but the effective end of our relationship. Family members who would need to understand why their travel plans were now pointless and their excitement had been misplaced. But the emotional destruction was even more comprehensive. Within 7 days, I had lost my wedding, my fiancé, my family's respect, and my confidence in my ability to build stable relationships with people who could be trusted to honor their commitments when maintaining them became inconvenient. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to create a systematic plan for managing the crisis that had consumed my life. But every line I wrote revealed new complications that I had not anticipated, and additional relationships that had been damaged beyond repair by the choices other people had made on my behalf. The wedding vendors would demand immediate notification to avoid additional penalties. Jake's family would need to cancel their travel arrangements and understand why their investment in our celebration had been wasted. My own extended family would require explanations that somehow acknowledged the crisis without completely destroying my father's reputation or my sister's recovery from her divorce. Most importantly, I would need to develop a new understanding of my place in the world and my ability to trust the people who claimed to care about my welfare. The betrayals I had experienced were not isolated incidents but revelations about how the people closest to me understood loyalty, commitment, and mutual obligation. As I made lists and calculated costs and composed explanations that would minimize damage while acknowledging truth, I realized that the comfortable life I had built through careful planning and responsible decision-making had been as fragile as tissue paper, vulnerable to destruction by anyone with sufficient emotional manipulation and moral justification for breaking their commitments. The woman who had confidently planned a wedding 6 months earlier, secure in her relationships and optimistic about her future, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned that love was conditional, promises were negotiable, and family loyalty flowed in only one direction. The descent toward rock bottom had begun with shocking speed and systematic precision, but I had not yet reached the absolute lowest point that would force me to discover what I was truly capable of becoming when everything familiar had been stripped away. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 3 weeks after what should have been my wedding day. I found it taped to my apartment door when I returned from another unsuccessful job interview. The bright yellow paper stark against the burgundy paint, like a neon sign announcing my complete failure to maintain even basic adult responsibilities. The notice cited failure to pay rent for 2 consecutive months and gave me 72 hours to vacate the premises. The timeline was impossible, but the debt was accurate. I had missed September rent while dealing with the wedding crisis, then October rent when my reduced work hours made the payment mathematically impossible. November was approaching with no realistic prospect of improvement. My financial situation had deteriorated with shocking speed once the wedding cancellation fees, vendor penalties, and relationship dissolution expenses accumulated into an insurmountable burden. The non-refundable deposits alone totaled $18,000, money that Jake and I had paid jointly, but that became entirely my responsibility when he decided that associating his finances with my family problems represented unacceptable risk exposure. The photography contract included a clause requiring full payment regardless of whether the event occurred, based on the photographer's advance preparation and blocked calendar dates. The catering company retained 50% of our deposit to cover food orders that could not be canceled within 2 weeks of the ceremony. The venue charged us for setup and breakdown services even though no celebration had taken place, arguing that their staff had been scheduled and their facilities had been reserved exclusively for our use. Each vendor notification had triggered additional fees and penalties that transformed our careful financial planning into a cascade of obligations that exceeded my individual ability to satisfy. Jake had initially agreed to split these costs equally, but his commitment to shared responsibility dissolved when his family attorney advised him that continuing financial entanglement with my situation could create legal liability for my family's future decisions. The dissolution of our joint financial arrangements had been handled through Jake's attorney with clinical precision that prioritized his protection over equitable distribution of our shared losses. Our joint savings account was divided equally, but since most of the wedding expenses had been paid from that account, my portion barely covered half of the outstanding vendor obligations. Jake retained possession of items we had purchased together for our future household, reasoning that his stable housing situation made him the logical custodian of shared property. More devastatingly, Jake's withdrawal from our relationship had triggered a cascade of social and professional consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Our shared friend group had naturally gravitated toward supporting him during our separation, particularly after his family began sharing their perspective on my family's financial irresponsibility and its impact on his emotional well-being. The narrative that emerged portrayed Jake as a victim of my family's dysfunction, rather than a partner who had abandoned me during a crisis. His friends understood his decision to protect himself from ongoing exposure to my family's problems, while my emotional response to his abandonment was characterized as evidence of my inability to handle adversity maturely. Professional consequences had followed quickly once word of my personal situation spread through the renewable energy industry networks, where Jake and I had both built our careers. Phoenix's clean energy sector was surprisingly small and interconnected, with professionals frequently moving between companies and collaborating on projects that required trust and reliability. My reputation for stability and professional competence became questioned when colleagues learned about my family's financial chaos and my inability to manage the resulting personal crisis effectively. Project assignments became less frequent as supervisors concluded that my emotional state and family obligations made me unreliable for client-facing work that required consistent performance. The reduction in professional opportunities had created a downward spiral that made each month's financial obligations more difficult to meet than the previous month's responsibilities. My salary as a marketing coordinator had been sufficient for my previous lifestyle, but it could not absorb the additional costs created by the wedding crisis while maintaining my existing commitments. The apartment eviction represented the final collapse of my attempts to maintain normalcy through individual effort and determination. I had exhausted my savings, borrowed against my retirement account, and even sold jewelry and electronics to generate cash for essential expenses. But the mathematical reality of insufficient income and excessive obligations had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Standing in my apartment hallway, holding the eviction notice while neighbors avoided eye contact as they passed, I experienced the peculiar clarity that comes from reaching absolute bottom. All of my strategies for managing the crisis through careful planning and responsible decision-making had failed completely. Every attempt to maintain dignity and independence while solving my problems had proven inadequate to the scope of the destruction others had created in my life. I returned to my apartment and sat on the couch that would soon belong to strangers, surveying the life I had built through 8 years of steady employment, careful budgeting, and responsible relationship choices. The furniture I had selected piece by piece while building my independence after college. The books that represented my interests and intellectual development. The photographs documenting friendships and achievements that had once seemed permanent and meaningful. All of it would disappear within 72 hours because my father had decided that my sister's problems were more important than my commitments, and because the man I had planned to marry had concluded that supporting me through adversity represented unacceptable personal risk. The phone call to my parents was the most difficult conversation of my adult life. I had maintained no contact with them since our argument about the wedding fund, partly from anger but mostly from pride. Asking for help now meant acknowledging that they had been correct about my inability to handle the situation independently, and that my objections to their choices had been the unreasonable protests of someone who lacked proper perspective about family priorities. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had been expecting this call and had prepared for its emotional difficulty. "Isabella, we have been worried about you. Your father and I have been hoping you would reach out when you were ready to discuss things calmly." The suggestion that my previous emotional response had been evidence of inadequate calm rather than reasonable reaction to betrayal established the framework for any assistance they might provide. Help would be available, but only after I acknowledged that my anger had been inappropriate and accepted their moral authority to redirect my resources according to their judgment about family needs. "Mom, I need to ask for help," I said, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. "I have been evicted from my apartment and I do not have anywhere else to go. Can I stay with you and Dad temporarily while I figure out what to do next?" The pause that followed was long enough for me to understand that this request had been anticipated and discussed, with conditions and expectations already established for any assistance they might provide. My parents had prepared for my eventual surrender to their authority, and they were ready to implement terms that would prevent future conflicts about family priorities and resource allocation. "Of course you can come home, Mija," my mother finally responded, her voice warming with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been validated by events. "Your room is exactly as you left it, and we have been keeping it ready for whenever you decided to return to your family." The characterization of my request for emergency housing as a decision to return to my family revealed how they had processed my opposition to the wedding fund transfer. My financial independence and autonomous decision-making had been viewed as temporary rebellion against proper family hierarchy, rather than legitimate adult development that deserved respect and support. "However," she continued, "your father and I expect that you will use this time to understand why family loyalty must come before individual wants, and why Carmen's crisis required the sacrifices we all made for her children's protection." The expectation that I would use my residency in their home to develop proper gratitude for their decision to destroy my wedding plans represented the complete inversion of accountability that had characterized their response throughout the crisis. I was being offered shelter in exchange for accepting responsibility for my own victimization and expressing appreciation for the moral lessons it had provided. "Isabella, your father wants to speak with you." my mother said after outlining the philosophical expectations for my return home. He has something important to say about your situation and how we can help you rebuild your life properly. The transition to my father's voice carried the weight of final authority and moral instruction that would determine the terms under which assistance would be provided. His tone combined paternal affection with educational firmness, indicating that he viewed this conversation as an opportunity to complete the life lessons that recent events had begun. Misha, I am sorry that things became so difficult for you after our conversation about the wedding money. He began with the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this approach. I know you were disappointed, and I understand why the situation felt unfair from your perspective. But I hope you can see now that individual happiness must sometimes be sacrificed for family welfare. The apology for my difficulties was carefully constructed to acknowledge my emotional pain, while maintaining that his decision had been morally correct and practically necessary. He was expressing regret for the consequences I had experienced, without accepting responsibility for the choices that had created those consequences. The truth is, Isabella, that this experience has taught you important lessons about what really matters in life, and what kinds of people deserve your loyalty and trust. Jake showed his true character when he abandoned you during a difficult time. Your real family is the people who will always be here for you, no matter what challenges arise. The reframing of Jake's abandonment as a revelation of his inadequate character rather than a reasonable response to my family's demonstrated unreliability represented the systematic revision of history that had allowed my parents to maintain their moral authority throughout the crisis. Jake's decision to protect himself from ongoing exposure to my family's problems was being characterized as evidence of his unworthiness, rather than logical consequence of their behavior. When you come home, we will help you understand that marriage should be based on shared values and family commitment, not just individual attraction and personal convenience. The right man will appreciate your family loyalty and want to be part of our support system, not separate you from it. The prescription for future relationship success required finding someone who would accept my family's authority, to redirect my resources, and reorder my priorities according to their assessment of relative need. Any partner who expected financial boundaries or independent decision-making would be viewed as attempting to separate me from appropriate family loyalty. Furthermore, this experience has shown you that independence is an illusion when it is not supported by family unity. Individual success means nothing if it comes at the expense of family relationships and mutual obligation. True security comes from family commitment, not personal achievement. The philosophical lesson was designed to transform my career ambitions and financial independence into character flaws that had contributed to my current crisis. My attempts to build autonomous adult life were being reframed as selfish rejection of family interdependence that had left me vulnerable when individual resources proved inadequate. The conversation concluded with arrangements for my return to their house the following day, but the terms of residency had been clearly established. I would be welcomed as a daughter who had learned important lessons about family priorities, not as an adult child requiring temporary assistance during a crisis created by others' choices. That evening, I packed my remaining possessions into boxes and suitcases that represented the physical remnants of 8 years of independent adult life. The books that had educated me, the clothes that had represented my professional identity, the household items that had created the domestic space where Jake and I had planned our future together. As I sorted through items that would go into storage versus items that would accompany me to my childhood bedroom, I realized that I was not just losing my apartment and my possessions. I was losing my identity as an autonomous adult, capable of making independent decisions, and maintaining financial boundaries with family members who claimed unlimited authority over my resources and my choices. The woman who had confidently planned a wedding and built a career, and maintained an independent household, was being systematically erased by circumstances beyond her control, and choices made by people who claimed to love her. In her place was emerging someone who had learned that love was conditional, promises were negotiable, and individual achievement was meaningless without family approval. But as I taped the final box and prepared to surrender my keys to the apartment manager, I experienced an unexpected moment of crystalline clarity that cut through the despair and self-pity that had dominated my thoughts for weeks. The people who had destroyed my comfortable life had also inadvertently freed me from the illusion that comfort and security could be built on other people's reliability and good intentions. I had lost everything I thought I needed to be happy and successful, which meant I was finally free to discover what I actually needed to build a life that could not be destroyed by other people's choices. The foundation of external validation and family approval that had supported my previous identity had been completely demolished, forcing me to find out what remained when all of those supports were removed. For the first time since the wedding crisis began, I felt something other than despair or anger. I felt curiosity about who I might become when I stopped trying to recover what had been taken from me, and started building something entirely new from whatever materials I could create or acquire independently. The rock bottom that had seemed like complete destruction was beginning to feel like bedrock that could support construction of something far more substantial than what had been lost. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I also had nothing left to fear from the people who had taught me that their love came with conditions I was no longer willing to accept. Moving back into my childhood bedroom felt like archaeological excavation in reverse, each familiar object and faded poster. A reminder of the person I had been before independence taught me that comfort could be temporary and promises could be broken. The room had remained unchanged during my 8 years of adult life, preserved like a museum exhibit of adolescent dreams and ambitions that now seemed naive in their optimism about personal agency and individual achievement. My parents had installed a new desk near the window where I could work on job applications and financial recovery planning, but the gesture felt more like providing equipment for supervised rehabilitation than supporting genuine independence. The understanding was clear that my residency represented temporary refuge while I learned proper lessons about family priorities, and developed appropriate gratitude for their willingness to rescue me from the consequences of my excessive individualism. The job search process revealed how completely my professional reputation had been compromised by the social and emotional aftermath of the wedding crisis. Phoenix's renewable energy sector operated as an informal network where personal recommendations and professional relationships determined advancement opportunities more than formal qualifications or demonstrated competence. My association with family financial chaos and relationship instability had created skepticism about my reliability that made traditional employment paths increasingly difficult to navigate. Interview conversations consistently shifted from discussions of my technical qualifications toward questions about my personal situation and my ability to maintain professional focus despite family obligations and emotional stress. Hiring managers expressed concern about my availability for travel assignments and client responsibilities, given my recent history of personal crisis and family involvement in my financial planning. The questions were legally problematic but practically devastating, since my honest answers confirmed that my family had demonstrated willingness to involve me in their emergencies, regardless of my professional commitments or personal plans. No amount of assurance about future boundaries could eliminate the precedent that had been established, or the reasonable concern that similar disruptions might occur whenever family members face difficulties requiring financial assistance. After 6 weeks of unsuccessful job searching and increasingly uncomfortable conversations with my parents about my progress toward financial independence and proper perspective about family obligations, I had begun considering positions outside the renewable energy sector that offered lower wages but potentially fewer reputation complications. The temporary employment agency that specialized in administrative and clerical work seemed like a practical solution for generating immediate income while rebuilding professional credibility in an environment where my personal history would be less relevant to job performance evaluations. The work might be less intellectually engaging than my previous marketing responsibilities, but it would provide financial stability and the psychological benefit of productive activity during my recovery period. Natalie Rodriguez, the agency coordinator who interviewed me for potential assignments, represented the first person in months who seemed genuinely interested in helping me succeed, rather than evaluating my worthiness for assistance or measuring my gratitude for opportunities being provided. Her approach combined professional efficiency with personal warmth that made our conversation feel collaborative rather than judgmental. "Isabella, I want to be direct with you about what I see in your application and interview," she said after reviewing my resume and discussing my current situation. "You are significantly overqualified for most of the positions we typically fill, but you are also dealing with circumstances that make traditional career advancement challenging right now." The acknowledgement that my qualifications exceeded the available opportunities while my circumstances created practical limitations felt refreshingly honest compared to the diplomatic rejections I had received from renewable energy companies. Natalie was addressing the reality of my situation without suggesting that my personal crisis reflected character defects or professional inadequacy. However, I have been working in employment services for 12 years, and I have learned that temporary setbacks often create opportunities for people to discover alternative career paths that they would never have considered under normal circumstances. Some of our most successful client relationships have developed from situations where traditional employment was not immediately available. The suggestion that my current difficulties might lead to unexpected opportunities rather than permanent professional damage represented the first optimistic perspective I had encountered since the wedding crisis began. Natalie was proposing that my situation contained potential for growth and development, rather than just requiring damage control and reputation rehabilitation. I have an assignment opportunity that might interest you, though it is quite different from your previous work experience, she continued, opening a file folder that contained position details and client information. One of our long-term clients is looking for someone with strong communication skills and project management experience to help coordinate a special initiative they are launching. The client was the Phoenix Community Resource Center, a nonprofit organization that provided services ranging from emergency financial assistance to career development training for individuals and families facing various forms of crisis. The position involved coordinating their new financial recovery workshop series, which was designed to help people rebuild their economic stability after experiencing job loss, family breakdown, medical emergencies, or other circumstances that had disrupted their financial security. The interesting aspect of this position, Natalie explained, is that the organization specifically prefers candidates who have personal experience with financial adversity and recovery. They believe that lived experience creates credibility and empathy that cannot be developed through academic training or professional development alone. The preference for candidates with personal experience of financial difficulty represented a complete reversal of the employment dynamics I had been encountering in traditional corporate environments. Rather than viewing my recent crisis as a liability that created questions about my stability and reliability, this organization considered such experience as qualification that enhanced my ability to serve their mission effectively. The position is initially part-time and grant-funded, so it does not offer the salary or benefits you were earning in your previous role, Natalie acknowledged. But it does provide an opportunity to develop expertise in a growing field, and the organization has a track record of promoting successful coordinators into full-time management positions as their programs expand. The opportunity represented both practical solution to my immediate financial needs and potential pathway toward career development that aligned with knowledge I had acquired through unwanted personal experience. My recent education in financial crisis management, family conflict resolution, and recovery planning had given me insights that could benefit others facing similar challenges, transforming my personal suffering into professional qualification. The interview at the Phoenix Community Resource Center took place in a converted warehouse space that housed multiple nonprofit organizations serving populations that traditional institutions often struggled to assist effectively. The building hummed with activity from job training programs, legal aid services, mental health counseling, and various initiatives designed to address systemic problems through community-based solutions. Maria Santos, the director of the Financial Recovery Workshop series, conducted the interview in a small conference room decorated with success stories and testimonials from program participants who had achieved various forms of stability and independence after experiencing significant setbacks. The atmosphere was purposeful and optimistic in a way that contrasted sharply with the crisis management focus that had dominated my recent interactions with family members and potential employers. Isabella, Natalie shared some general information about your background and your interest in this position, Maria began, her tone conveying both professional focus and personal understanding. I would like to hear your perspective on what qualifies you for work in financial recovery education, particularly given your previous experience in marketing rather than social services. The question provided an opportunity to reframe my recent experiences as professional development rather than personal failure, and to demonstrate how adversity had created capabilities that traditional career progression might never have developed. I explained how the wedding crisis had forced me to learn about vendor contract negotiation, crisis budgeting, asset protection, and relationship conflict resolution under extreme pressure and with significant consequences for making mistakes. More importantly, I continued, I have learned the difference between theoretical knowledge about financial planning and practical experience of making decisions when every option involves significant loss and when emotional pressure makes logical analysis difficult. I understand what it feels like to have carefully constructed stability collapse suddenly, and I know how overwhelming it can be to rebuild when the people you expected to support you become additional sources of stress. Maria's response indicated that my personal experience had indeed created exactly the type of credibility and insight that the organization valued in their educational programming. Isabella, one of the biggest challenges we face in financial recovery education is helping people understand that their crisis does not reflect personal failure, and that recovery is possible even when traditional support systems are unavailable or unreliable. The perspective aligned perfectly with my own recent education about the difference between individual responsibility and systemic factors that could create financial vulnerability regardless of personal effort and careful planning. My experience with family betrayal and relationship abandonment had taught me that recovery often required developing independence from the very people and institutions that society suggested should provide support during difficult periods. The participants in our workshops are dealing with job loss, medical bankruptcy, divorce, family crises, and various other circumstances that have disrupted their financial stability, quote, Maria explained. Many of them are struggling with shame and self-blame, particularly when their families or communities suggest that their problems reflect character defects or poor decision-making. The description matched my own psychological journey through the immediate aftermath of the wedding crisis, when I had questioned whether my reaction to my father's betrayal revealed selfishness and immaturity rather than reasonable response to broken trust and violated boundaries. The process of distinguishing between appropriate personal responsibility and external factors beyond individual control had been crucial to maintaining psychological stability during the worst phases of my recovery. Our workshop curriculum focuses on practical financial management skills, but it also addresses the emotional and relational aspects of financial recovery, Maria continued. We help people develop strategies for maintaining boundaries with family members who create financial pressure, for evaluating potential partners and friends based on their demonstrated reliability rather than their expressed intentions, and for building support networks that enhance stability rather than creating additional vulnerability. The curriculum represented exactly the type of education I wished had been available during my own crisis, when I was attempting to navigate complex family dynamics and relationship challenges without clear frameworks for understanding what was happening or practical strategies for protecting my own. The position offered 25 hours per week coordinating workshop logistics, facilitating participant discussions, and developing educational materials based on current research and participant feedback. The salary was significantly lower than my previous marketing position, but it would provide sufficient income to contribute to household expenses while living with my parents and beginning the process of rebuilding financial independence. More importantly, the work offered an opportunity to transform my recent suffering into service that could help others avoid similar problems or recover more effectively when such problems inevitably arose. The knowledge I had gained through unwanted experience could become professional expertise that justified the losses I had endured and created meaning from circumstances that had initially seemed purely destructive. Isabella, I would like to offer you this position, pending reference checks and background verification, Maria said at the conclusion of our conversation. Your combination of professional skills and personal experience matches exactly what we need for this program, and your enthusiasm for the work is evident in how you have discussed your own recovery process. The job offer represented the first positive development in my professional life since the wedding crisis began, but it also marked a fundamental shift in how I understood career development and personal achievement. Rather than viewing my recent experiences as temporary setbacks that needed to be overcome in order to return to my previous trajectory, I was beginning to recognize them as preparation for work that might be more meaningful and sustainable than anything I had previously considered. That evening, I called Natalie to express gratitude for connecting me with an opportunity that felt like genuine professional development, rather than just temporary employment during a difficult period. Her response revealed that she had recognized something in my situation that had prompted her to consider this particular assignment as potentially transformative, rather than merely practical. Isabella, I have been placing people in positions for 12 years, and I have learned to recognize when someone is ready for work that matches their actual capabilities rather than just their immediate needs, she said. Your recent experiences have given you insights and skills that could make you exceptionally effective in helping others navigate similar challenges. The conversation continued with Natalie sharing her own background in employment services and her observations about how personal adversity often prepared people for professional roles that utilized their hard-earned wisdom in service of others facing comparable difficulties. She had watched numerous clients transform their most painful experiences into their most valuable professional qualifications. The people who are most effective in recovery and support services are usually those who have experienced genuine crisis and found ways to rebuild that did not depend on external rescue or family intervention, she explained. They understand the difference between help that empowers and help that creates dependency, and they can recognize the signs when someone is ready to take responsibility for their own recovery. The analysis helped me understand why traditional employment opportunities had felt increasingly unsatisfying even before the wedding crisis had made them practically unavailable. My previous work in renewable energy marketing had been professionally competent, but emotionally disconnected from any larger purpose or personal mission that justified the time and energy required for career advancement. The position at the Community Resource Center offered the possibility of work that integrated personal experience with professional service in ways that could create sustainable meaning and satisfaction regardless of external validation or family approval. The mission aligned with values I had discovered through adversity, rather than values I had inherited through social expectations or educational programming. As I prepared for my first day of work in a role that existed because of rather than despite my recent difficulties, I realized that the unexpected angels who had appeared during my darkest period were not people who had rescued me from my problems, but people who had helped me recognize that my problems contained opportunities for growth and service that comfort and security had never revealed. The community of support that was emerging around my recovery consisted of individuals who understood that genuine assistance involved helping people develop their own capabilities rather than providing temporary relief that maintained dependency on external resources and approval. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared commitment to personal development rather than family obligation or social convention. For the first time since the wedding crisis began, I was building connections with people who valued what I had learned through suffering rather than suggesting that my suffering reflected character defects requiring correction or moral education requiring supervision. The foundation for a different kind of life was beginning to take shape, constructed from materials that could not be taken away by other people's choices or destroyed by circumstances beyond my control. The Phoenix Community Resource Center operated according to principles that challenged everything I had previously understood about professional success and personal achievement. During my first week coordinating the Financial Recovery Workshop series, I discovered that effective service to people in crisis required abandoning conventional approaches to problem-solving and relationship building that had been central to my previous career in corporate marketing. Traditional business culture emphasized controlling variables, managing risks, and achieving predictable outcomes through careful planning and systematic execution. The renewable energy sector had rewarded my ability to develop marketing campaigns with measurable results, clear timelines, and quantifiable return on investment calculations that justified resource allocation and strategic decision-making. Working with individuals recovering from financial catastrophe demanded completely different skills and perspectives. Participants arrived at workshops carrying trauma, shame, and practical challenges that could not be resolved through logical analysis or systematic planning. Their recovery required emotional processing, relationship repair, and gradual development of capabilities that emerged through experience rather than instruction. Maria Santos had warned me during my interview that successful coordination of financial recovery programming required patience with nonlinear progress and comfort with uncertainty about outcomes. Participants often experienced setbacks that disrupted their advancement through curriculum materials, and their personal crises frequently interfered with attendance and engagement in ways that made traditional program evaluation metrics misleading or counterproductive. Isabella, one of the most important things you will learn in this work is that genuine recovery cannot be rushed or managed according to external timelines, she explained during my orientation to the program Philosophy and Service Delivery Methods. People heal and develop new capabilities at their own pace, and our role is to provide support and education when they are ready to receive it, not when our schedules suggest they should be ready. The perspective required fundamental adjustment of my expectations about professional efficiency and measurable achievement. My previous marketing responsibilities had involved managing campaigns with specific launch dates, budget constraints, and performance indicators that determined whether projects succeeded or failed according to predetermined criteria. Success meant delivering promised results within established parameters and exceeding client expectations through superior execution. Financial recovery education measured success through participant transformation that often occurred months or years after workshop completion, and through changes in personal behavior and relationship patterns that could not be quantified or attributed to specific interventions. My effectiveness would be evaluated based on my ability to create safe environments for learning and growth, rather than my capacity to produce immediate behavioral change or measurable skill acquisition. The first workshop session I coordinated focused on emergency budgeting techniques for people whose income had been suddenly reduced through job loss, medical crisis, or family breakdown. 12 participants attended, ranging in age from 23 to 67, representing diverse backgrounds and circumstances that had led to their current financial vulnerability. Sarah Chen was a software engineer whose technology startup had collapsed after 18 months of development, leaving her with significant debt and no immediate employment prospects in a field that emphasized continuous advancement and cutting-edge expertise. Her situation resembled my own professional challenges, though her crisis had been created by market forces rather than family betrayal. David Martinez had been successfully managing a family restaurant until his father's unexpected death triggered inheritance disputes that eventually forced the business closure and created legal expenses that consumed their savings. His experience with family conflict over financial resources resonated with my own recent education about the ways that family loyalty could become a source of financial pressure rather than security. Jennifer Williams was recovering from a divorce that had left her responsible for child support obligations and household expenses that exceeded her income as a part-time administrative assistant. Her former husband had managed their finances throughout their marriage, leaving her without practical experience in budgeting, investment planning, or credit management when she suddenly became solely responsible for her economic survival. Each participant carried unique circumstances that had disrupted their financial stability, but they shared common emotional responses that included shame about their current situation, anxiety about their ability to recover independently, and skepticism about advice from people who had not experienced similar challenges. Their previous attempts to seek help had often involved interactions with financial advisors, social workers, and family members who provided suggestions based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience with crisis management. My role involved facilitating discussions that helped participants develop practical skills while processing the emotional aspects of their situations that interfered with effective decision-making. The curriculum included worksheets for expense tracking and budget planning, but much of the valuable learning occurred through conversations where participants shared strategies they had discovered and offered support for challenges that others were facing. The most important thing I learned during my first month of unemployment, Sarah shared during a discussion about maintaining motivation during job searches, was that I needed to structure my days as if I were still employed, with specific times for applications, networking, skill development, and personal care. Without that structure, the depression and anxiety became overwhelming. Her insight about the importance of maintaining routine during periods of uncertainty provided practical guidance that was more valuable than abstract advice about time management or goal setting. Other participants asked detailed questions about her daily schedule and her methods for maintaining accountability when external supervision was not available. David contributed strategies for managing family pressure about financial decisions, particularly when relatives offered assistance that came with expectations about how resources should be used, or when family members expressed opinions about recovery priorities that differed from his own assessment of his needs and circumstances. My mother kept suggesting that I should accept help from my uncle who wanted to loan me money to restart the restaurant, he explained. But I realized that accepting his money would mean accepting his involvement in business decisions, and that the family dynamics that had caused problems with the original restaurant would continue in any new venture he was financing. His decision to pursue employment in restaurant management rather than business ownership represented the type of practical wisdom that emerged from experience with family financial relationships. His example helped other participants consider whether assistance from family members would enhance their recovery or create additional obligations that could complicate their independence. Jennifer's contributions focused on the emotional challenges of rebuilding financial confidence after experiencing betrayal by someone who had been responsible for protecting her economic security. Her recovery required learning practical skills that her former husband had managed, but it also involved developing trust in her own judgment about money management and future planning. The hardest part was not learning to balance a checkbook or understand credit card interest rates, she said during a discussion about financial literacy education. The hardest part was believing that I could learn those skills and make good decisions independently, when I had been told for 15 years that I was not capable of understanding money management. Her insight about the psychological dimensions of financial recovery highlighted the importance of addressing confidence and self-efficacy alongside practical skill development. Many participants needed permission to trust their own assessment of their situation and their own priorities for recovery, particularly when family members or social service providers offered conflicting advice about appropriate strategies. The workshop discussions revealed that effective financial recovery required participants to develop discrimination between assistance that empowered their independence and assistance that maintained their dependence on external management. Family members often provided help that came with expectations about gratitude, compliance, and future availability for similar assistance when other relatives faced difficulties. Professional service providers sometimes offered solutions that addressed immediate symptoms, while perpetuating underlying vulnerability to future crises. Emergency financial assistance could provide temporary relief, while preventing the development of skills and resources that would reduce the likelihood of requiring similar assistance in the future. One of the most important questions I learned to ask, said Margaret Rodriguez, a participant who had successfully rebuilt her finances after medical bankruptcy, was whether the help someone offered would increase my capabilities or increase my obligations to them. Real help makes you stronger and more independent. Fake help makes you more dependent and more grateful. Her distinction between assistance that enhanced capability versus assistance that created obligation provided a framework that participants could apply to evaluating family offers, social service programs, and professional advice about recovery strategies. The criterion shifted focus from the immediate relief provided by various forms of help toward the long-term impact on personal agency and independence. My coordination responsibilities included documenting participant progress and program effectiveness for grant reporting requirements. But I discovered that the most meaningful changes often occurred outside the formal curriculum and could not be captured through traditional evaluation methods. Participants frequently mentioned that casual conversations before or after sessions had provided insights or encouragement that influenced their recovery more significantly than specific educational content. The informal community that developed among workshop participants created support networks that continued beyond program completion and provided ongoing accountability and assistance that supplemented rather than replaced professional services. These relationships were built on mutual understanding of recovery challenges rather than hierarchical expertise, creating peer support that was often more sustainable than professional intervention. Maria encouraged me to participate in monthly coordination meetings where staff from various programs shared strategies for effective service delivery and discussed systemic issues that affected their participants' recovery outcomes. These meetings revealed the broader context within which individual financial crises occurred and the institutional factors that influenced whether people successfully rebuilt their economic stability. Individual financial literacy education is important, explained Carlos Mendoza, who coordinated job training programs for people re-entering the workforce after incarceration or long-term unemployment. But most of the people we serve are facing systemic barriers that cannot be overcome through better personal financial management alone. Recovery requires developing skills for navigating systems that were not designed to support their success. His perspective helped me understand that my own recent difficulties reflected institutional factors as well as individual circumstances. The renewable energy industry's informal networking systems had amplified the reputational damage from my family crisis beyond what would have occurred in professional environments. With more formal evaluation procedures and stronger protections against personal bias affecting employment decisions. The Community Resource Center addressed these systemic issues through advocacy initiatives that complemented their individual service programs. Staff members participated in policy discussions about housing affordability, healthcare access, employment discrimination, and financial system reform that could reduce the frequency and severity of the crises their participants experienced. My participation in these advocacy efforts provided education about the broader economic and political context within which personal financial recovery occurred. The knowledge enhanced my effectiveness in workshop coordination by helping me understand the external factors that participants faced and the realistic timeline for achieving various recovery goals given current policy environments. The most significant learning from my first 3 months at the Community Resource Center involved recognizing the difference between help that rescued people from their circumstances and help that equipped people to rescue themselves from current circumstances while building resilience against future challenges. The distinction required constantly evaluating whether program activities enhanced participant agency or created dependency on continued service provision. Effective financial recovery education helped people develop internal resources for decision-making, problem-solving, and relationship management that could not be taken away by changes in external circumstances. Participants who achieved sustainable recovery learned to distinguish between temporary setbacks and fundamental threats, and they developed strategies for maintaining stability that did not depend on perfect conditions or unlimited external support. The skills I was developing through coordinating these programs differed substantially from the marketing capabilities I had cultivated during my previous career. Rather than managing campaigns designed to influence consumer behavior through persuasive messaging and strategic positioning, I was learning to facilitate processes through which people discovered their own capabilities and developed their own solutions to challenges that required sustained effort and personal transformation. The work demanded emotional intelligence, cultural competence, and systems thinking that had been less central to my previous professional responsibilities. Success required building trust with people who had valid reasons for skepticism about professional expertise, and maintaining hope for long-term recovery while acknowledging the realistic challenges that participants faced in rebuilding their economic security. Most importantly, the position was teaching me that meaningful professional contribution could emerge from personal experience, that traditional career development would have considered liability rather than qualification. My recent education in financial crisis management, family conflict resolution, and independent recovery planning had created expertise that benefited others facing similar challenges, transforming suffering into service in ways that justified the losses I had endured, while creating sustainable purpose for my future development. The breakthrough moment arrived during the 6th week of my coordination responsibilities, when Jennifer Williams approached me after a workshop session with a proposal that would transform both her recovery trajectory and my understanding of what constituted meaningful professional achievement. Her suggestion emerged from careful observation of program gaps and participant needs, demonstrating the type of practical innovation that arose when people with lived experience were empowered to contribute solutions rather than merely receiving services. Jennifer had been attending workshops consistently since my first week at the Community Resource Center, progressing through curriculum modules that addressed emergency budgeting, debt management, and financial planning with the methodical determination of someone rebuilding fundamental capabilities after devastating loss. Her divorce settlement had left her responsible for expenses that exceeded her part-time income, while simultaneously requiring her to develop financial management skills that her former husband had monopolized throughout their 15-year marriage. During our individual consultation sessions, Jennifer had revealed sophisticated analytical thinking about systemic barriers that prevented workshop participants from implementing strategies they learned during program sessions. Her insights reflected not only personal experience with financial recovery challenges but also professional background in administrative coordination that provided organizational perspective on service delivery effectiveness. Isabella, I have been thinking about something that might help other participants bridge the gap between workshop learning and practical application, she said, settling into the consultation chair with the focused energy of someone presenting a carefully developed proposal. Many of us understand the budgeting concepts and debt reduction strategies you teach, but we struggle with accountability and encouragement when we try to implement them independently. Her observation addressed a fundamental limitation that Maria Santos and I had discussed during supervision meetings but had not yet developed systematic approaches to resolve. Workshop participants often demonstrated clear comprehension of financial management principles during group sessions, but they frequently encountered implementation challenges when attempting to apply new strategies within their daily routines, without ongoing support or external accountability structures. I have been successful in reducing my monthly expenses by 30% and eliminating 2 credit card balances since starting the program. Jennifer continued, sharing progress documentation that demonstrated consistent application of workshop strategies over 8 weeks of independent effort. But I know that my success came from having experience in project management and goal tracking from my previous administrative work. Other participants need more structure and support to achieve similar results. The documentation she provided included detailed expense tracking spreadsheets, debt reduction timelines, and personal reflection notes that revealed sophisticated understanding of both practical financial management and psychological factors that influenced implementation success. Her materials demonstrated the type of systematic approach that could serve as a model for other participants, while highlighting capabilities that workshop programming had not fully utilized. What I would like to propose is developing a peer mentorship component that pairs participants who have achieved specific recovery milestones with newer participants who are just beginning to implement program strategies, she explained, presenting a written proposal that included program structure, participant selection criteria, training requirements, and evaluation methods. The peer mentorship concept represented exactly the type of program innovation that could enhance service effectiveness, while creating leadership opportunities for participants who had developed sufficient stability to support others facing similar challenges. Jennifer's proposal addressed practical implementation barriers, while building community connections that could provide ongoing support beyond formal program completion. Her written proposal demonstrated professional competence that had been obscured by her financial crisis, but remained available for productive application when appropriate opportunities emerged. The document included needs assessment data she had gathered through informal conversations with other participants, research about peer support models used in similar programs, and detailed planning for pilot implementation that could be evaluated and refined based on initial outcomes. Jennifer, this proposal addresses exactly the type of program enhancement that we have been considering, and your approach demonstrates thorough understanding of participant needs and organizational capabilities. I responded, reviewing her documentation with growing excitement about the potential for collaborative program development. I would like to discuss this with Maria and explore possibilities for implementing a pilot version of your peer mentorship model. The conversation marked the first time since beginning my position that I had encountered a participant whose recovery had progressed to the point where they could contribute to program improvement rather than simply benefiting from existing services. Jennifer's readiness to assume leadership responsibilities represented successful achievement of program goals, while creating opportunities for expanding service capacity through peer education and support. Maria's response to Jennifer's proposal exceeded my most optimistic expectations about organizational flexibility and participant empowerment. Rather than viewing the suggestion as potential interference with professional service delivery, she recognized it as evidence of program effectiveness and participant development that should be supported and celebrated through formal implementation planning. Isabella, this is exactly the type of outcome we hope to achieve through our financial recovery programming, Maria said during our next supervision meeting, reviewing Jennifer's proposal materials with obvious satisfaction. When participants develop sufficient stability and confidence to mentor others, it demonstrates that they have internalized program principles and achieved genuine recovery rather than temporary symptom relief. The organizational philosophy that celebrated participant leadership rather than protecting professional territory represented a fundamental difference from corporate environments where innovation suggestions from clients might be viewed as criticism of existing services or attempts to circumvent established expertise. The Community Resource Center's mission prioritized participant empowerment over professional control, creating space for collaborative program development that enhanced rather than threatened staff authority. Furthermore, peer mentorship programs often achieve outcomes that professional services cannot replicate, because they provide credibility and understanding that emerges from shared experience rather than academic training. Maria continued. Jennifer's success in implementing workshop strategies while managing single parenthood and employment challenges gives her expertise that complements rather than competes with our professional programming. The recognition that participant expertise complemented professional knowledge rather than challenging it provided a framework for collaborative service delivery that could enhance program effectiveness while creating meaningful roles for people whose recovery had progressed beyond their need for intensive support. Jennifer's transition from service recipient to program contributor represented a form of success that justified both her individual effort and organizational investment in her development. The pilot implementation of Jennifer's peer mentorship program became my first major project responsibility that extended beyond routine coordination tasks toward genuine program innovation and leadership development. The initiative required proposal writing, budget planning, staff training coordination, and evaluation design that utilized capabilities I had developed during my previous marketing career, while applying them to mission-driven work that aligned with personal values and professional interests. The grant application process for funding the peer mentorship pilot provided education about nonprofit resource development and social service program evaluation that expanded my professional knowledge beyond marketing communications toward areas that could support long-term career development in community-based organizations. Writing funding proposals required different skills than developing marketing campaigns, but both involve strategic communication designed to persuade audiences about the value and effectiveness of specific initiatives. The application to the Arizona Community Foundation emphasized participant empowerment outcomes and community capacity building rather than traditional service delivery metrics, requiring me to articulate program benefits in terms of social change and individual transformation rather than quantifiable outputs and demographic reach. The process demanded deeper understanding of social justice frameworks and systemic change theories that provided intellectual foundation for effective advocacy and policy development. Jennifer's involvement in proposal development created genuine partnership between program staff and participants that demonstrated the collaborative potential that could emerge when people in recovery were recognized as resources rather than merely recipients of professional intervention. Her contributions to needs assessment, program design, and evaluation planning reflected capabilities that had been developed through crisis experience and recovery effort rather than formal education or professional training. The 3-month proposal development period provided opportunities for me to demonstrate project management capabilities while working with a team that included participant leaders, community resource center staff, and external consultants who specialized in peer support program implementation. The collaborative process required diplomatic skills, cultural competence, and systems thinking that challenged my professional development in ways that corporate marketing responsibilities had not demanded. Most significantly, the project allowed me to experience success that was measured through positive impact on other people's lives, rather than profit generation or market share expansion. The intrinsic satisfaction that emerged from contributing to Jennifer's leadership development and program enhancement exceeded the external validation I had received during my previous career, creating sustainable motivation that did not depend on recognition or advancement opportunities. When the Arizona Community Foundation approved our grant application for $15,000 to fund a 6-month peer mentorship pilot program, the celebration occurred not in corporate conference rooms, but in the Community Resource Center's multipurpose space, with participants, staff, and volunteers sharing pizza and expressing genuine excitement about opportunities for enhanced service delivery and participant empowerment. Isabella, your work on this proposal demonstrates exactly the type of leadership potential that we hope to develop through your position here, Maria said during the informal celebration gathering. Your ability to translate Jennifer's vision into fundable programming while maintaining focus on participant empowerment shows sophisticated understanding of both nonprofit operations and community development principles. The recognition felt different from performance evaluations I had received during my corporate career, because it acknowledged contribution to mission achievement rather than individual productivity metrics. My effectiveness was being measured through positive impact on community capacity and participant outcomes, rather than personal advancement or competitive superiority over colleagues pursuing similar objectives. Jennifer's response to our successful funding application revealed the transformation that had occurred through her recovery process and leadership development opportunities. 6 months ago, I was overwhelmed by basic budgeting concepts and afraid to make financial decisions without my ex-husband's approval, she shared with the group. Today, I am co-designing a program that will help dozens of other people develop the confidence and skills they need for independent financial management. Her reflection highlighted the type of personal transformation that justified both individual effort and organizational investment in recovery programming. Jennifer's development from crisis survivor to community leader demonstrated that effective social services could achieve outcomes that extended far beyond symptom relief or temporary assistance toward genuine empowerment and long-term capability building. The peer mentorship program implementation began 2 weeks after grant approval, with Jennifer serving as lead mentor coordinator while I provided administrative support and professional supervision. The role reversal allowed me to learn from her expertise in recovery strategies while contributing organizational knowledge and resource development skills that enhanced program sustainability and effectiveness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.